Hello, everyone. This is Gary. I wanted to follow up from Dr. Peter Bishop's lecture that you'll be watching this week with a similar message around introducing future studies and this notion of foresight, and try to make a few more specific connections to this notion of era-based analysis. So what you see on this screen is widely considered to be the set of major market transitions in the world of energy. So on the left, you see concepts and dynamics of the global energy landscape that are descriptive of recent past and current day business models. So conventional fuels are those traditional hydrocarbons, oil, coal, natural gas. OECD refers to nations that are a part of a joint economic group that is often described as kind of the mature economies versus non-OECD, which is the emerging economies of the world. The China, Brazil, Indian economies are under the non-OECD category. So we see these are the major market transitions. We'll be going into more detail around each of these as we move forward, but I just want to kind of give you a set of transitions that are common to the world of energy and those that we'll be exploring in more detail. So the big one in terms of the global stage is to recognize that we've gone through different eras of economic growth in the past 50 years, all of which have shaped energy policy. Post-World War II was really the beginning of life as we know it, as your parents know it. This is the world where it was basically North America and Western Europe as the dominant economic and cultural powers of the world. It was kind of the end of the colonial age of European dominance, and that was the West-to-West economy. Then what we saw in the 1990s was a shift from East to West. This is where Eastern economies started to open up and provide low-cost outsourcing for manufacturing that was very appealing to America and Western Europe. And what this did is it shifted demand to Eastern economies, so China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, which was already strong at the time, all started to become greater consumers of electricity and energy consumption for manufacturing. And now when we look forward, we hear economists talk about this notion of a south-to-south economy. So the economic growth and the demand for energy and trade of natural resources is likely to go from southern to southern hemisphere economies. So when we look at energy partnerships today, it is China partnering with Angola. It is India partnering with Singapore. It is not necessarily the United States partnering with these regions as much as it is themselves partnering with other emerging economies. So this is kind of the big era transition in terms of the global stage. And we can see here in this chart from the U.S. Energy Information Agency that all the growth in the world moving forward is in this non-OECD category, which includes the emerging economies of the world. For the most part, the United States and Europe have plateaued. Efficiency gains year on provide us with an opportunity to continue to grow, but also at the same time decrease total energy consumption. So this is the landscape of this southern to southern economy. So when we think about the world of electricity production or power production, same term, power production is used to describe the electricity world. We can imagine two futures. One is this business as usual future where central power grids are the dominant source of electricity for the world, and that kind of favors the incumbents and the current regulatory framework. Or we can imagine a new energy era, and this is one that's characterized by more distributed ways of producing electricity, either from solar or fuel cells, or some different type of non-centralized system could emerge as the 21st century model. So this is one alternative future that we're going to be exploring this semester. So Dr. Bishop introduced this notion of a cone of plausibility. This is a very simple but profound mental model that futurists use to describe the future in a different way. So rather than only seeing one expected future, futurists like to frame the world in terms of multiple outcomes over multiple time horizons. So within this cone of plausibility, there are likely to be events and new trends that lead to different scenarios, different futures that are not based off of a mere extrapolation of current trends forward. So this cone of plausibility is the mental model that you want to use when we talk about the future of energy and the environment. We cannot make a specific prediction about what will happen, so it's important that we refer to the future in terms of plausible futures, plausible scenarios. And Dr. Bishop went into this a little bit more detail, but this is the visual of this cone of plausibility concept. So then within that cone of plausibility, we see that there are three mechanisms of change, right? So when you ask yourself what goes into that cone of plausibility, there are three things that can shape those futures. The first deals with trends. Trends are slow changes over time. Slow changes over time. Trends go up or they go down. It could be a decreasing cost in the typical solar panel. It could be an increased cost of the price of oil. It could be an increase in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. A trend goes up or a trend goes down. And within that future, we can use forecasts, which simply extrapolate current conditions forward at a certain rate and at a certain momentum to achieve the most plausible future. So that's the first mechanism of change. The second mechanism of change is a source of discontinuity. It's something that brings a break in that current trend path, and it's an event. Events can be mild or wild. A mild event is something that occurs possibly at a local level. It could be the decision by a local utility to start a certain policy, or it could be some sort of wild card event, something that has high impact but is very low in probability in terms of occurrence. So the tsunami in Japan 2 years ago has reshaped the landscape of power production in Japan away from nuclear power. And now the country is scrambling to find new sources of non-nuclear energy. So events give us a break from that plausible future, and we cannot forecast events. You cannot predict that certain events will happen, so we need to use scenario thinking. And scenarios are simply fictional stories about the future. So then the final mechanism of change consists of our choices, right? It's the things that we choose to do in the world. It might be investing in a renewable portfolio standard. It could be investing in energy efficient products. It could be a decision to allow the development of shale natural gas within a particular state. Choices reflect our preferred future. It's the world that we want to see happen in the future. So we don't use forecasts or scenarios. We use visions to determine what choices can do for us in terms of a preferred future. So the main purpose of this screencast is to make the distinction between two types of innovation in the world of energy. The first type of innovation is incremental. It preserves the rules of the game, the expectations of the existing customer base. It leverages existing technology platforms, and is really the majority of types of innovation that you see in the world, right? It's incremental innovation. Never really surprises me. It's very familiar. But what we want to focus on is the transformational innovation, the disruptive innovation that is characteristic of a new era. And this notion of era-based change is what we want to focus on this semester. So there's a difference between capturing the value of the existing rules of the game versus creating new value around a new set of rules. So if you think about this S-curve model, which is commonly associated with era-based thinking, there are 3 stages of development. The first stage of the S-curve model is the period of slow change. This is when we see change happening in the world, but do not necessarily think that it's going to have a big impact, so we tend to underestimate the amount of change happening. And then as more adoption occurs and technology improves, we enter a period of rapid change. And this is when we tend to overestimate the amount of change happening in the world and kind of oversell the future during the period of rapid change. Then as the adoption kind of plateaus and people are no longer overwhelmed or underwhelmed by the technology in this particular era, we reach a plateau of change, a mainstreaming. And this is when we begin to see a decrease in the return on our investments. This is a very important concept that when you invest in something during the slow and rapid change, you receive a greater return on that investment because the growth is ahead of you. When you're at the plateau of change, all the margins have shrunk and the return on that investment becomes diminishing. So futurists are individuals that help organizations understand where we are in terms of the development across this S-curve era. So just look at a very common example that you're going to immediately recognize, and that is the notion of era-based innovation in transportation. So we did not go from walking on the ground to walking on the moon by doing it faster. We learned how to do things differently, and each one of those stages that you see in front of you is reflective of an era of transportation and mobility. So what do we learn? Well, one, these eras, they don't go away. So we still walk, we still ride rail and take boats and drive cars, even though we can take rocket ships and planes to any place on the world. So eras do not go away. And when we talk about the future, let's say the future of solar energy, it's important that we recognize that the era of other sources of energy are not likely to just disappear. So the second thing we learn is that expertise doesn't always transfer. So people that did really well in the boat era of transportation may not have been successful in the era of rail. And the final thing that we can see is that these transitions take a very long time to unfold. And the best general time frame for era transitions around a particular technology is about 40 years. So roughly speaking, technologies have a 40-year lifespan from kind of start to rapid growth to slow growth and plateau. So the question then is what is next in terms of transportation? And this is really more just to drive home a point than it is to highlight the specific details, but it is this notion of autonomous vehicles that are able to communicate with other cars, dynamically adjust their speed and brake, and essentially avoid collision, cars that do not crash. Now the transition phase here is where the car provides assistive support to the driver. So we're not going to just jump into cars driving themselves. First, we're going to enter a world where cars provide the human driver with support, and that allows the confidence and the cultural change to occur. But what you see in this chart is a strengthening of signals, a strengthening in the performance of autonomous vehicles, all the way from the DARPA Military Grand Challenge, which was basically college teams developing these robotic cars, to current day where companies like Google and Ford have logged hundreds of thousands of miles of autonomous vehicle operation in the real world. States such as Nevada and California and Arizona all have legislation now that is either passed or is close to being passed that will allow these vehicles to be integrated real-world situations. So this is an example of an S-curve that is starting to enter a point of rapid growth. And when we think about that as a comparison with energy, we want to recognize that some things that are happening in energy are not well positioned for growth. Others are. So another example with era-based innovation deals with manufacturing. We live in a world shaped by plastic and silicon. Right? All of the things in our modern age are products of the plastic, the polymer age of materials manufacturing, and silicon. And we want to ask ourselves, well, what is next? One of those things relates to this notion of nano structured materials. Nano is a scale of engineering and science. It is the billionth of a meter scale. So it is at the level of individual atoms and molecules that we find nano structured products. So the transition here is a little different in this slide, and it really deals with broad capabilities. So the first phase of nano materials was about characterization. We want to understand the properties, the character of these things like carbon nanotubes and graphene sheets, which are single layers of carbon. We want to characterize those things and understand what they do. Now we have shifted into the era of functionalization. And functional means that you're able to integrate it into existing products, right? So you're able to take nano-structured materials and integrate it into current manufacturing tools and machines and product lines. So the transition that we're seeing today of functional nanomaterials is likely to have a major impact on things that are related to energy systems. We're going to go into more detail later, but I want to kind of plant the seed on some of the ideas that we're going to be exploring much later in the semester, and asking the question, how might nanomaterials lead to a future of low-cost, high-performance materials that can transform everything from cleaning up of hydrocarbons to supporting solar and wind and fuel cells and batteries, to transforming building systems and the materials that we use to coat windows or insulate pipes and walls. Nanomaterials will transform our world in a way that is bigger than the internet and anything digital. So how will nanotechnology in the era of nanostructured materials shape energy? A major question. So this is an era of media and communication. I want to kind of draw a connection to the world of energy. Socially, we all know that we've passed from the era of broadcast media, right? This is where one producer controlled through print or television or radio the message that was delivered to everybody. And now we're kind of a few years into the social media era, where many people create content, share content, edit it, and the dynamics are much more networked and harder to control. So that's kind of the social side. But there's an era beyond social media called machine to machine, M to M. And it's this world that we see new types of things emerging around the connection of devices. So in this future, the light is a part of the web. And because the lighting system, that device, that machine, is a part of the web, you are able to control that device via the web. So we can imagine a future of smart energy systems that allow individuals and companies to better manage the efficiency of lighting and heating and cooling systems merely through being connected. So this notion of smart energy systems is really rooted in the next era of media and communication, which is referred to as machine to machine. So the big change here is that there are new players in this market, and it's companies like AT&T and Verizon that are likely to be the dominant players in this connected devices world, often referred to as the Internet of Things. So later on in the semester, we're going to look at this notion of how these connected devices could lead to greater efficiencies in the use of energy. So now we'll just kind of wrap things up and really look at eras of energy. We see on the screen the historical energy eras of our age and of lives before us, and we recognize that we do live in an era of the central grid, of electricity, and an era of oil and gas. Now, it's not to say that coal is not a dominant fuel source. It certainly is, but it is no longer considered to be the driver of change in terms of innovation. It has just kind of plateaued and entered a stage of diminishing returns. So the question then is, what's next for the world of energy? I just want to highlight a few era transitions because we're going to go into more detail later. I want you to understand the principle of era-based transitions. So there is a transition that's occurring from geo extraction, so the geological extraction of energy, coal, natural gas, oil, to a world where we grow energy. And the assumptions of the previous era are rooted in geological engineering, whereas the assumptions about how the world might be different in this emerging era are rooted in the world of biosciences. So there are a lot of myths and I think mismanaged expectations about bioenergy. We are not talking about the future of bioenergy around plant-based fuels or food crops becoming part of the energy system. Right? That is a near-term reality of the transition. We will likely see plant-based solutions using the marginal lands and certain crops that don't compete with food. But for the most part, there is a much stronger case to be made for the growing of energy using microbes and algae as the dominant biological medium for growing these fuels. So when we talk about a fuel, we're talking about molecular bonds. Those molecular bonds are made up of carbon and hydrogen, and when we split those chemical bonds, we get energy from that reaction. And we're going to go into more detail on that later, but we need to be clear that we're talking about molecule fuels. That is what dominates the world today. So this era transition from geology to biology is a major transition for us to be explored. And later in the semester, we'll be looking at some of the decision factors that are important to it. So the road of bioengineering around energy systems is very long, and there is a big idea that we're going to get to towards the end of the class, referred to as synthetic biology. And this is a world where Exxon has put a lot of money in basic research with an algae firm, and what they're trying to do is understand the ways that we can grow fuel in different ways. And this approach of synthetic biology is that we can maximize the proteins and enzymes that are used to convert carbon into a carbon-hydrogen fuel, or some enzyme that will split water to create hydrogen. We can maximize that performance by knowing the genomic sequence that codes that protein, that enzyme. If we're able to develop our own genome that will then code and produce the enzyme, we can maximize efficiencies. So this is one of these breakthrough ideas that could have a major impact on energy in the future. But we're going to get into the details a little later. So the final two era transitions deal with power production and electricity. The dominant model of our world over the past 60 years has been based off of a central power grid. So fuel, coal, natural gas, oil, wood, biomass is brought to a large power plant that usually costs anywhere from $5 to $50 million. They produce a lot of energy by going through a number of different steps. They boil the water, they create the steam, they turn the turbine, it drives the electricity being produced, and then it gets sent out over the wires. And that is the world as we know it today. The new era that we want to explore, and this is an alternative future, is one of distributed power generation. And the most likely candidate here is the fuel cell. We'll get into details in the fuel cell in, I think, week 5 or 6. But a fuel cell basically converts chemical energy, so it converts molecular bonds into electricity and heat and water, steam, in a single step. So rather than going from fuel to steam to turbine to wire to product, it goes straight from fuel, the molecule, into electricity in a single step. It's a solid-state device, so there are no moving parts, and the cost structure over the long term is very favorable in terms of being competitive with the central grid. So that is one alternative future that we're going to be exploring, and we'll look at some scenarios where we imagine how consumers might begin to pull themselves off the grid by purchasing their own fuel cells at a local retail store and using natural gas as their main fuel, and essentially go off grid. And what would that mean to cities and rural areas and utilities if people began to power their homes with their own fuel cells? And then a more radical idea is shrinking that fuel cell down to the size of something that would fit in the palm of your hand or inside of a cell phone or a laptop or a light bulb. And this is the idea of a micro fuel cell. And later on in the semester, we will look at an era of personal energy. And this would be a world in which any individual anywhere in the world, for a few cents and a few dollars, could purchase fuel and a power plant that fits in their hand. So rather than having people plug into the grid, they could carry around portable energy systems. So this notion of micro fuel cells and retail distribution of fuels is a very radical concept, and we'll explore a scenario in which this era of personal power becomes prominent in our world later on in the semester. So that's the end of this screencast. The S-curve model of change is very important for the rest of this semester. It's important that we are able to ask ourselves, what is the evidence of change that's happening in the world that we can see? What are the performance increases? What are the signals of change that are occurring on a particular energy concept? And how do we use those indicators of change to figure out where we are in that S-curve? So we can look at patents, we can look at investment levels, we can look at certain performance metrics, and we will use these types of indicators of change to describe where we believe we are on the S-curve stage of development for emerging energy systems. So that is the end of the presentation, and I will look forward to seeing your work this week and getting into the discussion center. Talk to you soon.